Welcome back, Stephen.
Hey, thank you.
How you doing, man?
Fantastic. So good to have a break.
I bet.
So good to have a break.
I bet. Well, last time you were with us, this is episode 11. And welcome, everybody, to episode 11 with Stephen Owens. He was our second person on Harvey County Digital.
Yeah.
And it was when you were in the campaign, in the throes. You just jumped in. It was the very, very beginning of it.
Okay.
You want to talk a little bit about that? And tell me a little bit, Stephen. We're going to cover several things today.
Sure.
Okay. We're going to cover education. We're going to cover marijuana, legalization of, and different facets there. Medical expansion was one that you brought up when you walked in.
Expansion.
Oh, sorry,
Yep,
Medicaid.
Medicaid expansion.
Medicaid.
That's
I didn't read it
right.
right.
You're good.
And that's one that you talked about when we walked in
Sure.
here, and I didn't
Yeah,
even have that
absolutely.
down, which is embarrassing. You're on the appropriations committee, and there's some things going on that we want to kind of unpack here.
Sure.
And then SB 22.
Yeah.
And so there's some big things that have happened. I've been watching your social media. You're doing a great job at
Thank you.
communicating. Do you know of any other state reps communicating like you are in a digital world?
Man, not the amount and the quantity and in depth like I am. And I
Yeah.
actually get a lot of compliments from people that just really love the realness, the
Yeah.
actual facts and the information that I'm putting out. So, and for me, it's all about allowing people to enjoy the experience and to experience what I'm experiencing and what I'm feeling, which is again part of why I love doing these things, because
Yeah.
I want people to be part of that journey with me.
Right. And, I want to circle back around because one other thing I want to bring up, because it's your thought process that I respect so much, because people that get to know you, they understand real quick who you really are, because you are who you are and you're authentic. You never get a fake Stephen
That's right.
Owens. It's a real Stephen Owens. When they were doing the death penalty,
Yeah.
that was a big one. So I'm going to write that down because I want people to hear your heart on this and how you process that.
Yeah.
Because you really realized how valuable we are and how irreplaceable life is.
Yeah.
And your faith and other things that you have in place for yourself and your family, the way you guys view life, and then to have to be put in a position to vote on something as dramatic as that and as finite as that. All right. You shared that with me, and I was just impressed with how you were processing and getting on the other side of it and going back and forth within your own head.
Well, at the end of the day, I mean, that's really what we're called to do, right? As legislators, I'm one of 125 representatives in the House of Representatives. There are then 40 senators on the Senate side, and then there's a governor. And it takes those three bodies, if you will, to sign off: the majority of the House, majority of the Senate, and then the governor's signature to create a law. So you have 166 people that have the decision-making power to create laws or to take laws away within the state of Kansas. And anybody that doesn't take the time and process through that is doing, a disservice to their constituency and to the state. So I'd love to talk about that, because it really is, there is so much that goes into it. So I don't know if you're ready to delve into that yet, or you want to go somewhere else. Totally
Well,
up to you.
I want to talk about your experience. Let's just
Yeah.
start with, before we get into the topics and issues, again, you want to share the experience, and I want to hear that more in detail, because we've been going 100 miles an hour in two different directions.
Yeah, what a crazy experience. You obviously have firsthand knowledge in helping me campaign, being out there hustling, knocking doors.
Yeah.
Number one supporter right here,
Ah.
and totally grateful, because I know I couldn't have done it without you, and I couldn't do it without my family, without question. So there's a handful of people that really made this opportunity possible, and that's really what this is. This is an opportunity to serve, and I've always looked at it like that. I've looked at this opportunity in this time in my life as an opportunity to serve the people, to give back to the state that has been very good to my family and I, to give back to the area, having been in Heston now for 22 years almost. Kansas is such a great place for family, a great place to start a business, and a great place to be. And I saw this as an opportunity to serve, not as an opportunity that I would ever let define me. And so we'll talk about that maybe a little bit, because as we campaigned and as we knocked doors, we started with a simple message. Not that there was any problem with the previous representative, because Don Schrader's a fantastic individual, and I will never say a negative word.
Awesome.
It was simply that he made some votes that I didn't agree with, and I felt like the district was ready for somebody new.
Right.
Don hadn't had an opponent in nearly 10 years. And I felt that they were really ready. And so after working with my family, working through the business aspects of it and making that decision to run, we jumped in and we started knocking doors with a clear message that we can do things within government to make it more efficient. We can do things without raising taxes. We can change some things and rethink the way that Kansas currently operates. And that's where Rethink Kansas was actually launched from. RethinkKansas.com was kind of our slogan. And, I made it clear as I'm knocking doors and I'm talking about the issues. I'm talking about where I stand on taxes, talking about where I stand on Medicaid expansion, talking about where I stand on the Second Amendment, where I stand on all these issues. And my feeling was always, I very much put it out there to people that if this is the way the majority of the electorate feel, then please vote for me. But don't vote for me if you don't feel the same way I do, because I'm going to go to Topeka and I'm going to be the same person there as I was before.
100%.
And so as I step forward with that, and as I look back on that and the process, I walked 189 miles, knocked thousands of doors in the heat of the summer because I only had a primary, didn't have a general election. And if anybody remembers this last June and July, it was hot.
Yeah, it was.
And my towel hanging out of my pocket, knocking doors, just talking to people saying, here's a new option. This is where I'm at. This is who I am. I'd love to have your support, which led to some really great conversations. And the night of the primary, I said was either going to be a great, victory celebration or a glad it's over celebration, because we worked hard. We left it all out there for the voters to decide. And ultimately the voters decided that they were ready for somebody new. They were ready for somebody that was more conservative than the previous representative, that could be a leader in Topeka. And that's what, ultimately launched us.
That's it. And what an experience to see you go through it. And just for purposes of podcasts, I've gotten some emails, ran into some people in public, and totally, this isn't off the cuff. It'll circle back around. I supported you. I supported Steve Kelly and Chip in this last election.
Sure.
And some people were like, well, is this going to be one of those channels where you just talk to a certain type of person? And I just want to say, for the record, we did have Tim Hodges on.
Cool.
But we weren't allowed to air that episode. And I wanted to. I thought it went great. We sent him the episode ahead of time, so there was no funny business, because we got a sense that there may be some discomfort there for whatever reason.
Okay.
So we shared it. And so we would love to have him on. I would love to get his perspective and his side as we go through some of these. And you said, if there's things you don't agree with, push back, because it's okay to disagree.
Absolutely.
And I know that's who you are, and you've always been that way.
Yeah.
And we are people, and sometimes, being able to respect somebody for knowing at least where they stand,
right,
is a good thing. And nobody in my camp hates Tim.
Right.
I respect him for stepping up and leading and doing the things that a lot of people will not do.
Right.
And the service that he's giving us, whether we agree with all his decisions or not, he's out there fighting
right.
for what he believes. And that's a great thing. And that's part of our democracy and part of our country, is we got a little bit of everybody out there. And I think there's things that we can agree on, for me personally and Tim, that we can get some work done. And it's about communication and just opening up those lines of communication.
So interesting thing about the legislature, right?
Yeah.
And I agree 100%. Tim's work ethic is unparalleled.
He killed it in the campaign.
He gets out there and he works his tail off.
Yeah, he does.
And while we don't see eye to eye on a lot of the bigger issues, the fact of the matter is we voted together about 80% of the time.
Ain't that something?
So one of the things that people don't see, and a comment that actually came up at a meeting that I was at this morning where Tim was at, was that we need more we and less I.
Awesome.
And the interesting thing is, very few people see the we that goes on in Topeka. There is so much that comes across our plate when we're voting on all of these bills that passed nearly unanimously, 124-1 or 122-3, right?
Yeah.
But those are the things that aren't talked about. People don't see how much really there is when we all come together. Tim said it this morning in a meeting we were at. When the Republicans and the Democrats, the liberals and the conservatives are on the same page, it's an unstoppable force.
Oh, that's great.
And that's exactly how we are about 80% of the time. There are the issues, of course, that are big issues that we're on a different side of the page. That doesn't mean that we're not civil to one another. We're I want to be challenged, just like I know he wants to be challenged.
Absolutely.
Let's bump heads. Let's put the pressure on each other. But at the end of the day, when it's all over, it's not like we're out in the street fist fights, because that's not the way the legislature works.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we can be there. We can be very emotional, very passionate about why we're doing what we're doing. And then once the vote is over, it's the vote of the people. It's the vote of the electorate. You accept it, you move on down the road. Medicaid expansion is a perfect example. Okay, and we'll touch on that a little bit, because I still want to stay on the process a little bit longer. And if we need to move on, feel free to redirect me.
No.
I like to talk about it because it is super important for as many people as possible to be part of that process, like I said. And that's why I like to share so much on social media, because I want people to know what it's like. I want people to know that most legislators, if a legislator is doing their job, they're at the Capitol between 7 and 8 a.m., and they're not back to where they get to go to bed till 9 or 10 o'clock every night. And then a good majority of those that do get back there, they're up another 2 or 3 hours reading bills, studying their positions, preparing for their committees, preparing for the bills that are going to be heard, preparing for the votes that they're going to take the next day. So your legislators that are up there have basically 90 days to get their job done, and they're working their tail ends off.
Wow.
Right? There's plenty of events. There are plenty of people that want your time. There's committee meetings. I was on 3 different committees. Those meetings were anywhere from an hour to 2 hours every single day. So that's upwards of 6 hours of committee work. Then you have events over lunch. You have events after dinner. And then in between there, you try to squeeze in the meetings with your constituents that come up and want some of your time, which is why we're there ultimately.
Right.
So everybody's up there really working their tail ends off to make this state better.
That's great.
And that's what we all remember. At the end of the day, we all want Kansas to be a better place for business, for family, for everybody. We just have different approaches on how to get there. So that's why the majority rules. That's why the majority rules on who gets elected. It's a beautiful process.
That's amazing to me. So the Stephen from campaigning, parades, shaking hands, walking 189 miles, all of that, to walking in your first day as a freshman. What did that feel like, and what is the emotion? Take me through the emotional side of seeing our house and what that looks like, and the relationships that you're building. Can you start from day one and then talk to me through this break? Just go ahead.
Every day, we went up there and we got swore in. And to walk in that building, that's hallowed ground. That's where our state has been built by the people that have come before me. And I'm one of, they say, less than 4,000 legislators to ever represent the state. And what a true honor that is. And I think about that every single time I see that building and I walk through those doors. Wow. That I'm one of so few to have the opportunity to serve in this capacity, to shape the future of this state. And so it was incredibly emotional to stand there, to raise my hand, and to swear to uphold the Constitution. To take that upon myself and that responsibility, you really do feel that weight. Starting off, it's incredibly overwhelming. You get into the committee process and you're hearing 2 and 3 bills a day in each committee. I was on corrections, juvenile justice, the Judiciary Committee, and then appropriations. And so we're learning so much about the corrections industry, which I have some experience with that and with judiciary, which is great. Mm-hmm. But to hear the issues, to hear the bills, to have testimony of the proponents, testimony of the opponents, sometimes neutral testimony, and people literally put that information on you for you to study and for you to process, and then to actually take a vote on that in committee to see whether that's something that we want to support going to the whole body. It's an enormous weight to think about how is this going to affect the state. And I process things in a number of different ways. I think about, I think about God. And when I look at this law, how would he feel about it? And I think about the family and how is this going to affect the family unit? Because I'm a fighter for the family. Mm-hmm. I think there's no more important unit in society than the family. And so I think about how's it going to affect the family. How is it going to, those are the two big things that I want to think about as I'm stepping forward and making these decisions. And so it's huge. It's an enormous responsibility. And to think about how those things are going to affect the state. Is this going to be beneficial? Is this going to be a detriment? Is this right for the constituents of the 74th House District? Is it not? Where do I stand on those? And then, I can't tell you the number of times I've had to look back myself because there's so many people whispering in your ear, sometimes loud, sometimes not loud. Right. You're getting thousands of emails a day. Do this, do that, do this, do that. This is important. This is important. This is what you should do. And so you're getting that constantly on both sides of nearly every issue.
Right.
And how do you sort through that? And so there have been plenty of times I've looked back at my website, for example. Okay.
Yeah.
And I've read every single stance that I took, every single newspaper article I wrote that asked questions of where do you stand on this, where do you stand on that, to ensure that I'm staying true to who I am.
That's great.
And to what I told people I was going to do when I went up to Topeka. Because win, lose, or draw, as we step forward in this process, I'm going to be true to myself, which means I'm going to be true to my constituents and the people that put their trust in me to go represent them on a state level. There's no doubt integrity is absolutely fundamentally the key and something that we don't see in politics very often. So I carry that forward and you bear that weight. And one of the votes that you talk about bearing the weight was the death penalty.
Yeah,
debate.
Big one.
I never thought in a million years that I would have to make that decision my first year in Topeka.
Right.
I knew at some point maybe, but it's been something that I have struggled with. Okay, and I've thought about this for a number of years even before this. Capital punishment is the ultimate finality, right? There's no room for error when it comes to the death penalty.
Right.
Somebody that's in prison, you can let back out, but there's no room for error on the death penalty. So as we sat there and as we heard testimony from all the people that were proponents for abolishing the death penalty, there were people that were victims of crimes that were standing their support, in support of abolishing it. There were people from, various church groups that were in support of abolishing it. There were people that made arguments about how physically inefficient that process is because we actually spend more to put somebody to death and to keep them on death row than we do just to put them on life in prison without parole.
Right.
You take all of that into consideration, but then we heard from law enforcement that wanted to keep the death penalty in place because it's a deterrent. We heard from judges that want to keep it in place because it's an important option. Even though nobody's been put to death in Kansas since, I believe it was 1966 or 1964, the option to do that is still very important. I'll never forget one gentleman that we heard from whose daughter was murdered, who stood right in front of us and said, please don't take this away. This is the only reason that we can sleep at night, is knowing that that person that did that to my daughter is going to die. The ultimate price for what he did and what he took. So how do you weigh all that? I'll tell you, we knew the vote was coming in committee because it was heard in committee and it gets voted on in committee. And then depending on what happens there, whether it goes to the floor for a whole debate or not. There are 13 people that sit on the corrections committee. And by the time we got to that point and made that final vote, I was so emotionally drained, having processed it, having thought through it, again, asking those questions from a religious standpoint, a moral standpoint, an ethical standpoint, and just all of these points, that when it came down to it, I was not prepared to take that option off the table. That doesn't mean that at some point in the future, that might not change.
Right.
But I can tell you at that time, after working through all of it, there were 6 people that wanted it abolished, and there were 6 people that wanted it left in place. Rarely does it come to a tie.
Right.
The only time that a chairman of a committee votes is when it's a tie. And when we had a 6-6 split tie, it tells you just how, and it wasn't a partisan vote. It wasn't a Democrat-Republican vote. These are just people weighing a very important thing. And ultimately the chairman voted to keep it in place as well.
Wow.
So with a vote of 7-6, it died in committee.
Wow. And that's one.
That's
decision.
one. It's just one decision. Now that was a hard one.
Yeah.
And there are 4 or 5 or 6 super, super difficult ones that we have to make every year. Some of them are pretty straightforward. Well, we need to technical fix in this statute or need to adjust some of that stuff's pretty straightforward. Still got to research it, but some of that's so draining. And I took the time to actually not only write out my explanation of why and post that online, but I took a video of myself in the Capitol. Because I want people, again, to really understand and to feel it. You know, some people think we go up there, we live the life of luxury, we're getting wined and dined all the time, everything's happy and hunky-dory and good. Well, that's not the case, right? We're getting paid $88 a day for our time.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, we get food paid for, thankfully, because at $88 a day, you know, there's not a lot there. And we do get a per diem, which is great for those that live more than 60 miles away. But there is so much time and emotional energy spent in making these decisions because we realize that. And I don't know a single person on that committee that didn't weigh on that day. And so I wanted to be very open and share that video because my office assistant even said, man, you just look wore out. And it's because I was. Right. And it was over a very difficult decision. So just share a little bit about that because that is this process. It is such an honor, like I said earlier, to be there. It's humbling to walk in those steps of the people before me, to take that responsibility on me. But no matter how exhausting it is, no matter how tired you get, you keep pushing forward because you want what's best for the state of Kansas. And I'm just so honored to be there and to be part of the process. It's crazy.
Well, thank you for doing it. And
it's amazing.
You know, a follow-up question to that is, do you feel like you got your feet wet?
Oh man, yeah, I got my feet wet. I got my knees wet. I'm chest high. I mean, without a doubt, there's so much thrown at you. Yeah. One of the committees that we could talk about briefly is appropriations, right? Appropriations is the state's checkbook. We had the opportunity to hear from basically every single state agency that the state of Kansas funds. One of my favorite processes by far was getting an overview of everything from commerce to ag to the Department of Health and Environment to, just all of these agencies and to learn about them. Man, it's incredible. I absolutely loved working through that process and being able to gather all that information.
How many people sit on that appropriations committee?
So appropriations committee, if I remember correctly, is 23.
Okay.
It's one of the largest. It is one of the largest committees along with taxation and Fed and state. Those are exempt committees, meaning that they're not subject to deadlines for bills to be introduced and worked and processed through the way that all the other committees are. Because the committee process works through, you take corrections, for example, a bill comes, chairman decides to hear it, there's a hearing. We have a deadline by which we have to vote for and push those out to be voted on the floor if they're going to. That's turnaround.
If they're going to.
So that's totally up to the chairman and up to leadership. But that's turnaround. That's where every House bill that we want heard has to be moved over to the Senate to be worked.
Yeah.
If we passed it. Well, with exempt committees, that process can continue to just go at any time. I mean, we could theoretically introduce a bill, work it in appropriations, vote on it, kick it over to the Senate, do the whole process in the veto session. But that's why those committees are exempt. But truly an awesome opportunity to set on appropriations and, again, live up to some of those campaign promises of where can we find efficiencies. What ultimately can we do better for the taxpayer financially? Because at the end of the day, one of the hardest things to do is to say no. But that's what you're doing. When it comes to finding efficiency, you're having to say no. It doesn't make sense to spend money on that. That's hard.
Perfect segue.
Yeah.
And I want to go into one of the things that I want to learn more about. education.
Sure. Yeah.
I was going to be a coach and a teacher coming up to Bethel College back in 1998, where I met you.
Yeah.
And I have lots of friends who are teachers and coaches and spending their life and all over the country, but many in Kansas. Spoken to Deb a couple different times. Deb Ham, she's been on our show.
Wonderful
as well.
lady. Wonderful lady.
She's great. And so I really want to talk about education and your views on that. And you said, you're making tough decisions, and where do you put this, and how does that look in the bigger picture given everything else you're overlooking?
Right.
And so let's get into education. Let's
because we came into this session knowing we were going to have to deal with education, right?
Right.
We've had this ongoing lawsuit, the Gannon lawsuit that's been ongoing for, I can't tell you how many years, been a number of years. And over the last 2 years, the legislature has invested enormous amounts of money in meeting that Gannon lawsuit requirement, okay, that the Supreme Court is saying that you have to spend more, you have to spend more. Well, after the last large amount of money, the Supreme Court ultimately said, okay, you've done good, but you need to adjust for inflation, okay? So realizing that K-12 education is about 53% of the state budget. So an enormous amount is spent there. It's a huge issue. So we knew that one of two things had to happen. Either we had to pass a bill agreeing to spend the money, or the flip side was it was time to stand up and tell the Supreme Court, no, you know what, we've given enough money, and possibly even look at a constitutional amendment that clarified the Supreme Court's role. Because there is ultimately the argument of it's a separation of powers issue.
Right.
It is the legislature's job in the state constitution to appropriate. Okay. It is our responsibility to spend that money.
Got it.
It is the Supreme Court's responsibility to interpret laws and to ultimately decide whether a law that has been made is being upheld. Well, that's where the Supreme Court got involved here, because there's an equity piece within the way the wording, and I don't have it right in front of me, but suffice it to say, and the Supreme Court has made the decision that they have purview over this issue. So here we are, we're faced with some tough decisions. So the Senate introduced SB 142, Senate Bill 142. Senate Bill 142 gave the school district basically unencumbered funds of $90 million per year, roughly. It's a little bit higher, a little bit lower, for 4 years. So 90, 90, 90, 90. They passed that, probably a good month ago, if I remember correctly. Passed it, I want to say, I'm not going to quote the numbers, but they passed it handily.
Right.
Well, the House took a different approach. The House said, look, if we're going to spend more money, we want to have some policy tied to it. We want to make sure that a certain percentage of this money is being used to mental health. Because there's a huge mental health crisis. We could have a whole podcast on mental health. But, we want some of the money to go here. We want to have some accountability within the school districts that says, hey, this money's being used for X. Or we want a report that says it's being here. Or one of the things was we wanted some accountability tied to classroom upfunding to ensure that the money is getting into the classroom.
Right.
Well, as the House took up this debate, ultimately the policy and the money were split into two separate bills, okay, so that there could be a vote on policy and there could be a vote on money. Well, there was a vote on policy finally, and it narrowly passed, 63 to 62, like narrowly passed, okay? The money side was never put up for debate, because the money side, basically what the thought was instead of funding this for 4 years, let's fund it for 2 years and let's put it in specific silos, because they believed on the House side that would meet the constitutional mandate as required by the Supreme Court. Well, it was never put up for vote because the votes simply weren't there. So you're left with the House's policy and the Senate's finances, the money side of it. When it came down to it, that ended up in conference committee. So anytime, if a bill is passed by the House or the Senate and then it's sent over to the other side, if there are differences in what ultimately passes the other chamber, or if it only passes one but not the other, it can go into what's called a conference committee report. That conference committee is where the leaders of each one of the committees Okay, the chairman, the vice chairman, and the minority chair get together, and the 6 of them kind of iron out the differences. And it's all about negotiation and bargaining, what everybody talks about.
Yeah.
Well, the House didn't have quite as strong of a position because all they had was policy. The Senate was very adamant about spending this money and not adding additional requirements to the school district. I thought some of the accountability pieces were incredibly valid. I thought it would add a lot of clarity. I thought that it would do a number of things that would be very beneficial for our schools. Sure, it would cost a little bit of extra work.
Right.
But anything that we can do to add transparency within a governmental agency or quasi-governmental agency, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Because this process, as I try to explain it online, I try to be very transparent.
Right.
Very open with my votes. I could hide some of the votes so that the voters don't see it, but I never do that.
Yeah.
Very
Just put
open,
it out.
very put it out there. That's the way that I like to see government agencies ran, schools included. So ultimately it came down to here's the conference committee report. There were a few minor transparency things put in, no major policy whatsoever, and spend $90 million more a year on schools. Now, let me add a little bit of context to this extra $90 million on schools. And again, this is the inflation adjustment.
90 mil.
Over the last 2 years, the legislature has appropriated over $2.5 billion with a B dollars to schools in additional funding over the next 4 years already.
Over the next,
Over the next 4 years,
Okay.
the legislature has appropriated over $2.5 billion in increase in base aid. Okay. A lot of money. So the 17 legislature and the 18 legislature all appropriated enormous amounts of money. And I can show you the graphs.
Yeah. I think I saw some of
it's all online.
I saw that online on your Rethink Kansas Facebook page.
Yep. And anybody
Stephen Owens at Rethink Kansas.
No, well, that's my email address. But Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I have them all now set up to where it is facebook.com/rep.owens. So if you just search in Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, rep.owens, you'll find me all over the place.
Rep.owens.
Yep.
And it'll take you to all the media.
Take you all to it. All this stuff I put out there, again, in the name of transparency. So now I'm faced with a situation where the Supreme Court says give them $90 million more, okay, which is $90 million on top of everything else for the next 4 years. So that's, 9 times 4, that's 36. That's $360 million on top of the $2.5 billion. This is where I'm tasked with being on appropriations, right? Looking at what are the needs throughout the state of Kansas. What needs need to be addressed now? Because we're here now. We need to address them now. Some would argue that the Supreme Court is the one telling us exactly which needs to be addressed right now. Okay? I look at it and I see we're in a state of emergency in various other aspects. We mentioned the mental health issues with our adolescents.
Big deal.
With people roaming the streets of Newton with obvious mental health issues.
Absolutely.
Wichita. Oh, man. Go down in the Main and Elm or the Broadway and Elm region.
I was there today.
Yeah. I mean, huge issues. Talk to ComCare. Talk to a lot of these talk to Prairie View. Talk to anybody.
Jails, hospitals.
Well, the jails have become the de facto mental health institutions because people get in trouble as a result. I mean, it's a huge issue. So I see that issue pressing down on the state.
Yeah.
Okay. I see the El Dorado Correctional Facility still under a state of emergency. Okay. Because of not being able to hire the people they need and having the funding that they need to retain people. They've got people working 12, 16 hours a day every day. You talk about putting some lives in danger. That's scary. There are things like this that when I stop and I think about, man, if I had $90 million in my hand, where is the best place? Where is the most urgent needs? Those are just 2 of about 4 or 5 that come to mind. So when I'm asked to balance that, and I'm asked to balance that with these needs over here, when the school system currently has 4 years of increases already on the books, every school district is going to get a 3% bump in state aid every year for the next 4 years. We're exclusive of this 90 million. This 90 million adds basically another 3%. Exclusive of that. Does it make sense right now today to spend 90 million more on schools when they already have increases? When we haven't even taken into account their LOB increases from property appraisal appreciation, which arguably is another 2 or 3%. So one could say the schools already are getting 5% increases. So my vote not to spend $90 million on schools was so that it could be put elsewhere, so that we could deal with more pressing needs right now. It's not because I don't have faith in our schools, because I do. I still have children in public schools.
Absolutely.
I love my school. We have phenomenal schools. We have great leaders, great teachers, great principals. There's argument about where the money gets spent within there and teachers and classrooms. There's all of that stuff.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I gave my explanation of vote. And I ended it with the line that one agency's inflation adjustment is life-saving money to another. So if you let that sink in for just a second, hopefully it helps people really understand, again, that process that I went through to really think through where are the true and pressing needs today? How do we address those? What more can we do to address them? So that is the reason that I couldn't support it.
Yeah.
Because they have increases in place for 4 years. There's not another state agency that has that. None.
Wow.
There's not another, nobody has those guaranteed increases already on the books.
See, unpacking it like this, where you actually have time, you're not
Right.
being cut off or talked over, or, the points that come in, or just the raw bird's eye view of how you're seeing this today, given all the information you're getting. And being on the appropriations committee opens up a lot.
Very much.
So this is a great. Thank you for sharing these perspectives. As I didn't realize that $2 billion. I didn't realize that.
And those are hard numbers. That's not numbers by Stephen Owens. That's not numbers by the Koch brothers or anybody else. This is numbers from the Kansas Legislative Research Department that anybody can access. That is their online independent group. Their job is to provide us data and do research. So those are the facts. Some would argue that it's still, the base aid is still below where it was in 2009, even with these increases. And while that may be the case, there have been a number of things that have shifted out of the state's hand to local hands. So schools still have had incremental increases every year, okay, in overall funding. And that's what you have to look at when you look at this, is what has happened with overall funding and all funding sources. And there has always been a steady increase in that when others have decreased dramatically. And we'll touch on some of the other things. But perspective from me. Others will not agree with that.
Absolutely.
And that's perfectly fine. Matter of fact, the majority didn't agree with that. That's why it passed the House.
Right.
That's why it passed the Senate. That's why the governor ultimately signed it. A lot of my constituents and friends, or a lot of my people that I've met that have become friends up there, they voted for it, not because they believe that the schools needed money, but because they hope and pray the lawsuit ends. And that was enough for them.
Do you have any idea the numbers lawsuit, how much that's cost us as a state?
I heard a year or two ago. It's
and
the
you didn't
lawyers.
look these numbers up. This is hearsay.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Ballpark.
This isn't specific. I read it somewhere. Take it
Okay.
for what it is, but it was over $7 million that they paid in attorney fees.
Okay.
Okay. So
I want to be a part of that law firm.
and that's taxpayers' money. So the taxpayer is suing itself with its own money for more money, and that's not fake news. That is what happens.
It is what it is.
So it is what it is, right or wrong, indifferent. A lot of arguments. That again could be a whole session in and of itself. But that was my logic and my rationale behind the decision that I make. again, love my teachers. I
Yeah.
can't fathom a better place, especially, and I can brag on Hesston because that's where my kids goes. From the superintendent to the principals to the counselors to the teachers, phenomenal. So certainly was never a vote against them.
Yeah.
It was simply
absolutely.
a prioritization vote.
I think if a lot of I have some great friends who are teachers,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure if they would disagree with you or not at this point. I haven't talked to them about this stuff,
Sure.
and a lot of them are just really loving and caring about our kids and trying
Right.
to worry about the day-to-day stuff. They're hoping that people make good decisions and
That's
are able
awesome.
to support the kids moving forward. And
that's what we need to
and,
do.
as one of my mentors used to say, some teachers should be cloned and some should be clubbed. Right? But he's
True.
I mean, that's everything. It's in
Yeah.
everything we have out there, every career. And I probably should be clubbed in my career, right?
What would be great sometimes to have a podcast where we had, maybe some teachers, some administrators, and some
Absolutely.
legislators on, and let's talk about how the system can be made better.
Absolutely.
Right? Because there are a lot of ideas about how we can make the system better, how we can incentivize teachers to do better. Because what we have seen is the scores within the school system and our rankings have not increased, especially when you compare it to the funding increases. We've seen some things happen in there. So how can we change that? Again, whole nother conversation for a whole nother time, but
No,
definitely
those
love
are very good ideas.
my teachers.
I can't wait to end here. I want to be on here. This is my therapy because we haven't been getting our sessions.
Right.
And so as I
He's
look through this-
setting a timer, man. Setting a
I'm
timer.
going to keep us on track for a couple reasons, but that's all really good. And I love the idea of actually having 4 or 5 of us really hashing this out.
Look, you think about it. Whether it's business, you and I hash out things all the time
All
to
the
make
time.
business better, to make business more efficient, to
That's
make
right.
it function better.
That's right.
Same thing can happen with government agencies. Same thing can happen with associations. Same thing happen with non-for-profits.
I believe that.
There's nothing wrong with saying we all can stand to do better, to be better, and to rethink and to look outside of what is normal to improve the process.
Absolutely.
It makes us all better.
Absolutely. People in the process, right?
Absolutely.
Medicaid expansion.
Wow.
That's a big one on here.
That's a huge one. Sure.
Can we run through that in about 8 to 10 minutes?
Yeah,
Can
well,
you
I will
open
make it
up,
a
man?
point to because Medicaid expansion is there's a lot of argument for it and there's a lot of argument against it. I have been against it since I started campaigning.
Got it.
I was very clear with people when asked the question, "Do you support Medicaid expansion?" I said no, and here's why. Not that I wasn't willing to learn, and
Yeah.
I have learned an enormous amount about it.
Yeah.
Okay. But what Medicaid expansion does, and there's a lot of misconceptions, but Medicaid expansion opens up government paid health care to people between the ages of 18 and 64 that are of working age. They're able-bodied individuals. Because remember, Medicaid already covers children. It already covers pregnant mothers. It already covers the disabled, and it already covers the elderly.
Right.
Okay, so all of that grouping is already covered under Medicaid. The expansion expands it to those that are 18 to 64. And then we ask ourselves, okay, what does that look like? And is Medicaid expansion really the best program? Some argue it is, because with Medicaid expansion, the state right now is responsible for only 10%. At its initial inception, the federal government paid 100%. Now the federal government is paying 90%. Okay. So if we expand Medicaid, the expectation is that it would be 100 to 150,000 Kansans that would get on Medicaid. Okay. About 40 to 50,000 would actually drop private insurance because they would qualify for the state insurance. Okay, which is very inexpensive in comparative. We'll go with that because one of the amendments made to expansion required $25 per month per person. Okay, so there's a little skin in the game there. Keep that in mind. But the federal government then covers 90% of the cost. Okay, so when Governor Kelly's budget came out, she allocated $14 million to cover the state's 10% of that cost. So the idea is you're going to have 90% of your tax money that you're already paying in come back into the state. There'll be some economic benefits. There'll certainly be some benefits to a number of the hospitals. Okay. there would be some jobs created as a result. There are a number of things that from a positive standpoint would happen. Not to mention, there are people that would have health care that don't have it currently.
Right.
That instead of going to the ER to seek treatment, can actually go to a family practitioner.
Right.
Can go to a critical care place. So it would change the whole system. Not to mention, it certainly could be beneficial to places like Prairie View. Right. Your community mental health centers and things like that for people that seek treatment that currently don't have insurance. Well,
right.
We know that puts the hospitals in a difficult place because they're required by law to make sure that life-threatening conditions are dealt with,
right.
regardless of somebody's ability to pay. So I understand that, and I'm sharing with you all of the pros, right?
Right.
The things that I have learned would be very beneficial to the state. So now we stop and we look at the cons. And it is my opinion, and it is still my opinion, that the cons outweigh the benefit. And here's some of the cons that go along to it. First of all, we're taking upwards of 40 or 50,000 people off of private insurance and putting them on a government subsidized plan that currently is subsidized by the federal government at 90%. So you're taking private out of the picture, which I have concerns with, for a state funded program that is nearly free of charge. Okay. What if the federal government says, yeah, you know what, we've tapped out, we're over $22 trillion in debt currently, we're going to cut that back to 80% or 70%. Then the state's share. Now remember, I said that Governor Kelly set aside $14 million, and one of the senators really nailed it on the head in the budget committee when he says, I think you missed it by a decimal point. Because if you do the math, 150,000 people, if 14 million is your 10%, you calculate your 90%, you add that together, you divide it by 150,000, it came up to a little over $900 per person in healthcare for a year. Can you get health insurance for $900 a year?
Oh God.
Can you even begin to go to an emergency room for $900 even once?
Gosh, no.
My son was just at the emergency room about a month and a half ago, and it billed my insurance over $5,000.
Yep.
And all he had done was blood work and an IV.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the numbers don't match with the budget, first of all. So then what if they change that? So let's say that real number is, I don't know, there are some arguments that say it's as low as $50 million, okay, to cover our 10%. Well, if the federal government changes that, then it becomes 100 million, 150 million, 200 million. What if ACA is totally thrown out, like a federal judge in Texas ruled last year that the ACA is unconstitutional because that tax or penalty is now gone? It rules the whole thing unconstitutional. That's going to be heard by the Supreme Court. More than likely, some people think it'll happen this year.
Wow.
So what if that's totally thrown out? We have 150,000 people on Medicare or Medicaid, excuse me. You really think anybody in the legislature is going to have the wherewithal to kick that many people off of insurance?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. So that burden then falls on the taxpayer.
Wow.
Okay. Well, that's just one piece of it. Okay. So, you're talking enormous amounts of money and enormous amounts of responsibility for a section of people that are working, are able-bodied people, right? Now, I'm not saying that there aren't working poor that certainly need some help when it comes to health insurance, but a lot of those already qualify for subsidies on the exchange the way it sits right now.
Right.
If healthcare insurance was a priority, they get subsidized. Some of them can get free health insurance even through there that qualify in there.
Right.
So are we creating another group of people that are now dependent on a taxpayer-funded system that everybody else has to bear that burden of?
Right.
That's where I have issues with. Okay, that's where I think about, is it really in the best interest of the state stepping forward that we continue to do this, or that we go down this path? Now, the way that it ended up being voted on in the House, okay, they did a gut and go. Democrats did a gut and go, was supported by a number of moderate Republicans. They gutted a bill, basically, and I won't get into the whole process, but suffice it to say, everybody hates gut and goes until it benefits them and their cause. Okay, they didn't feel like they could get it through the normal process.
Right.
They gutted another bill. They overruled the rules chair who ruled it not germane for the first time in history that anybody can remember, to insert this in and to force it to a vote. And it passed, I think it was 70. You got to have 63 to pass it. I believe there were 70 or 71 that voted for it. Now, with all of that being said, I didn't agree with leadership in the way that that was handled. I believe that if there is the support there, that it should have a fair hearing, that it should work through the process, that it should come to the floor, and that it should be voted on. Okay, whether I agree with it or not, if there's the support for it and the majority want it, that's just my personal feeling.
Yeah.
And so the fact that they had to go that route, I disagree with how it got there, but the fact that they felt like that was their only option, well, it's still an option, and they did it, and it passed. Now it's on the Senate side. Now, some argue that they're holding it up for fear it's going to be ruled unconstitutional. And here we are, even though this piece of legislation for Medicaid expansion says that if the federal funds go away, insurance goes away, we know how that will play out with the voter and with the legislature. And we know that then it still becomes a huge burden. So, man, really tough one. Again, I didn't support it because I see the system coming to an end. I see us creating a group of people that are, again, another group that are dependent on society. I think there's a better way. I believe there's a better way. I believe that if we can get the economy kickstarted, we can generate the funds. Maybe there's a way that we're able to help offset the cost of free health care to the emergency rooms, to the hospitals. There's concierge medicine, which is very inexpensive, a whole nother conversation. There are different models out there, and Newton is a prime example of a model that works with Newton Medical Center and Grace Med, right next door.
Yeah.
And how that has worked out. That's a federally funded facility that anybody can come to regardless of your ability to pay. You can go get primary care right there. There's so much to be learned from Newton Medical Center. Phenomenal hospital. Spent some time with their executive team a couple weeks ago. Man, what a knockout job those guys are doing. Well, real glad to have them as part of the community.
That was great to see you out there in Health Ministries. They're doing some great things. And I also saw in Halstead, I believe I saw Health Ministries,
a little clinic open up there.
Yep. And so they're doing some very creative things, getting stuff out there. It takes time.
So some of those federal funds are being drawn down because that's the way those guys operate, primarily with federal grant dollars to provide that. So is there a better way? That's what I want to look out before we jump down the Medicaid expansion approach, before we create this new system, we spend all this money. That, by the way, throw a caveat, not a single state that has expanded, which is over 30, has come in within budget. They all blow through their budget. Many of them have tried to get out of expansion afterwards. Others have raised the poverty limit to qualify or started charging people because it has just blown budgets out of the water.
I'm curious to see the comments as we have this piece out there and put these clips, because what I want to do is take Medicaid expansion and cut that from start to finish and place it out there, and then see what people say about it.
Because I would love to hear. Each one of these
will touch different types of people.
And I'm still learning, right?
Absolutely.
Here's the way I feel about Medicaid expansion. If the majority wants it and it passes the House and it passes the Senate, we know the governor's going to sign it. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that I am proved wrong, and that a year or 2 or 3 from now, I will come right back on here like I've been known to do. I've done it before on my Facebook page where I've inserted my foot and I've eaten crow.
Yes, you have.
Okay. I hope that I'm wrong on this if it's what the majority wants and it passes.
Right.
And that's the best I can say. I don't feel that I am, but that's the best that I can offer.
Right on, man. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Marijuana. Dum. We've got a lot of media play on this.
Oh, man.
Unfortunately, some of us shared it that have people in other states and all that. And I've noticed you were saying, hey, if in Kansas, give me your opinions, because those numbers can get weird.
Right. Yeah. And I love to run the polls online. They're totally unscientific polls.
Yeah.
But they're even more unscientific when it gets shared by a specific group that's out of state. And then you have all these people voting, because when I asked about, do you support medical marijuana in Kansas?
Yeah.
It overwhelmingly passed. but then I can look back and see who
where the
voted,
votes came
and
from.
the majority of them weren't even in the state.
So the power of social media is almost too powerful.
That's exactly right. So it
there
didn't.
were people voting from Colorado.
Well, invariably, or California,
Or
there was
Texas.
Washington, they were all over the place. Texas,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because I have a good friend from Texas that shared that.
yeah.
So, you take those for what it is. But what those do more than anything, spur a ton of comments
Yeah.
and a ton of conversation. And that's what I love about it.
Yeah.
I love conversation that is respectful and productive. Disagree with me?
That's great.
Absolutely love it. Let's go back and forth. Be respectful.
That's
The
it.
minute you're not respectful, you start name calling, I just ban you from the page and move on. Don't need that.
Keyboard commandos coming at you.
Telephone tough guys.
Yeah, I love it.
That's right.
I love it. Well, I've been personally back and forth for a lot of reasons for over the years, given a lot of reasons. But at the end of the day, I fall in support of legalization. Where do you stand with that, and what is your take on it?
Yeah, so I've been really clear that I don't support it. Again, from the onset, I don't support medicinal marijuana. I don't, support recreational marijuana. And again, we can go through the pros and the cons of it. I've seen some of the videos or the posts on Facebook where seizures have been controlled in children, where, there are all of these other things where it helps with depression and anxiety and this and that. And there's a lot of that there. The problem is it's not proven. So when you take a drug, this is a class 1 drug, okay? Some argue that it'll be descheduled by the federal government at some point in the future. And if it is, it is. We'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Right.
Okay. But if you take something along these lines and you allow it to become legal for medicinal purposes, you're allowing people to self-dose, self-administer. There's no quality guidelines. It has not been tested, vetted, any way, shape, or form. So you're allowing something as a state to occur that, one, is completely against federal law.
Right.
Still breaking federal law. Whether the feds ever do anything about it or not, it's totally up to them. Probably won't because of what's been going on, but it's still against federal law.
Right.
Yeah, it still affects your ability to purchase a firearm, affects your ability to drive, all these other things. But talking just about the medicinal piece, you're being your own doctor at that point, right?
Right.
Is it good? Is it bad? What percentage of THC is it? You have no idea, right? That they say the marijuana in the 60s is totally different than the marijuana today, because the marijuana in the 60s was about 3% THC. You can now get marijuana as high as 40 and 50% THC. Okay. So huge difference. That's like 3-point beer.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, 50% alcohol by volume.
Liquor. Yeah.
Total different beasts. So you have a very uncontrolled industry. Some say, well, you've got to go with medicinal. You got to go to your doctor to get your marijuana card. Well, what we've seen in a number of states, and I had one constituent reach out to me and say I should look at Florida as being an exception, which I haven't done yet, but I still will. You see in a lot of states where it becomes just very similar to recreational. You stub your toe, you go pay $200, you get your marijuana card, you can go smoke your weed. Okay. So
we're real loose with it. That's a big complaint we hear.
Find a doctor that says that inhaling smoke in your lungs is good for you. Haven't found one yet. Okay. All of these things is where I have issues. When people ask, do you support medical marijuana? I can say that I do. If it would go through the FDA process, if you would have to get a prescription to go to your local pharmacy for your licensed pharmacist to distribute that drug to you, that has been quality tested, that has been thoroughly vetted, reviewed, gone through the process. Okay. And again, they're not going to hand to you a sack of weed to go smoke.
Yeah. So, taking all of that, as I listen to that, what I've read and what I know up to this point, I have some personal views on that.
Sure.
I go kind of libertarian on this issue right here on this subject.
Fair enough.
Which is kind of, at the end of the day, there was a guy who wrote a book, and I'll get you the author. I'll send you the email, and I'll put it in the link below so they can see the book, which is he's against marijuana, and he says it's a bunch of hooey, all these things. So he admittedly on a podcast, and I'll share that with you so you can kind of see both sides. There was a doctor that debated him. And as they go through this debate, the doctor who is prescribing and is very careful and taking care of his patients and takes it very seriously, was debating this guy who said there's no good benefits. And this guy was saying, no, I have patients. But there's a bunch of extremists that say, hey, marijuana can handle everything and anything and everybody should be smoking.
Right, yeah.
You know,
Plenty of that out there.
Yeah, this culture where I think it causes problems because, no, I don't think it's right for everybody. Without a doctor being involved, I don't think you should be smoking it. My personal opinions and my personal views. But I think we should have access to it if it is helping a certain group or a certain person with certain illnesses. And why don't we have access, right? Those are the questions I have.
Sure.
So this one guy kind of did a very deep dive into how marijuana was bad and terrible and never should be legalized. But he also admitted that the reason he did that was to get people to wake up and to get people to start having the conversation. Not just, the world was tilting too far one way. And he thought it was a problem because there was nobody fighting for the other side. So he wrote this masterful book to bring it to the center to start the conversation on what it should look like appropriately, because there's more conversations happening and the loudest voices out there right now aren't looking at it appropriately in his view. So it's a great book. I'll share it with you.
Yeah. And I love that. I think the key, what you said, is appropriately. Yeah. What is the appropriate process?
Right.
Should it just be anybody who wants it can have it? Should it be through the FDA? Should it be some mix in between?
Right.
At the end of the day, what makes sense? And when you look at Colorado, some argue the economic bank, man, the tax money, they're making so much money on taxes. Well, their black market is even more because nobody wants to pay the 22%. I think it was 22% in taxes to buy it legally.
Right.
You have an increase in childhood overdoses, ER visits, automobile crashes, deaths. I mean, there's a lot of law enforcement studies out there from Colorado that show its effect.
Right.
Is that enough? Is it not? Is it worth it for the economic benefit, for the medicinal benefit? I won't say that I am a never know going to happen guy on this issue.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I will tell you, I will continue to learn. I will continue to study, and I will continue to see what that process ultimately looks like. The way that it is now and the way that it has been now, I still can't support it because we're opening a Pandora's box that we don't know.
Fair
and
enough.
There's so many doctors that talk about the psychosis that can be created, not by everybody, but by a lot of people that start smoking weed, get into the heavier weeds. What does that lead to? Do they need a higher high next time? Where does it go?
There's that in the book too.
Sure.
He dissects that. The Against Marijuana guy dissects that, and he makes it kind of like the other side makes their case.
Right.
It's bad for everybody. But the point he's making is it's not okay for everybody, because there are stories he has in there of actual people who they were scholars and the height of their game at Harvard, smoked one time, boom,
Changed.
Life is done. Mental institution.
Yeah.
Wow, this is real, right? That happened. And people's chemistry and wiring is different. What does that look like? We don't have the test. We don't know who that person is that's going to take that trigger the wrong way.
That's right.
But I still don't think we have it fully with all these other medications that are out there, where it's a big game where people know how to push them through and they know how to wash them into society. And I had a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, who overdosed about 4 or 5 years ago now. Rest in peace, Nick McGovern. And he was getting prescription meds.
Yeah.
And he found a doctor that was doing just like what some of these medical marijuana doctors do, which is signing people that come through the door and figuring a way to get them what they need. And he passed away. And this doctor, thank God, got some severe time. I think he got a life sentence.
Good.
And these are the things that we need to watch for, right? What does that look like? What are those processes that we have to put in place? But we don't know.
That's right. We don't know what we don't know.
That's right.
Right. And so where does that go? By the way, there are 2 legalized medications you can get through your pharmacist, through your doctor, write a prescription, that are now marijuana based, and there are more coming.
That's awesome.
So keep that in mind.
Yeah, and doctors will have access to those.
They absolutely have access to it.
Anything for seizures or that you know?
Seizures, and I was trying to remember some other neurological issue for another one, but yeah, there are two, and I can't remember the names off the top of my head when we were having this debate, because we had this debate in judiciary, believe it or not, and where there was a group of families that came together whose children were severely disabled, called Claire and Lola. It ended up being called Claire and Lola's Law. Yeah. You might have seen them on TV. Little bitty kids, beautiful, but severely disabled.
Right.
And they wanted the right to have 5% THC put in their CBD oil. Again, THC is the piece that gets people high.
Yeah.
Some people looked at this as mercy for these children. Others looked at it as the first
door.
stepping stone to opening the door.
That's right.
Right?
I hear it.
And I respect both sides of it. You are where you are. You got to take your own position, stand on it. It ended up passing judiciary. It ended up passing the House. And I believe it was in a conference committee that passed the Senate. And so if the governor signs it, it may be, we'll see what it is or it isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll have to put things in place as we go, depending on what happens there, right. if anything.
Exactly.
SB 22. Got 5 minutes on that?
Yeah. So SB 22.
Can you
talk about that? Yeah, I was going to do that for you. So SB 22 was the bill that was introduced in the Senate, thus Senate Bill 22, that allowed Kansans to have their windfall. We've heard about the windfall from the federal government when taxes were decreased on the federal government, where it requires Kansans to decouple, is what it's called. So break it down for you really, really quick. Federal government, when they passed their Tax Reduction Act, okay, on an individual side, they doubled the standard deduction for single married filing for all of them. For example, married filing joint, the standard deduction doubled from $12,000 to $24,000. As we all know, when we do our taxes, we take whichever is better, either itemizing our deductions, which is your home mortgage interest, charitable contributions, taxes, property taxes, stuff like that. If that's more than the standard deduction, you itemize. If it's less, then you take the standard deduction because you want the higher deduction. Yeah. Well, when they doubled it, okay, all of a sudden the standard deduction goes through the roof. Well, Kansas is coupled to federal. Whatever you do on your federal tax return, you're required by law to do on your state tax return. So if you take the standard on federal, you have to take the standard on state. Same thing, itemize, you have to itemize on state. Well, when the federal government doubled their standard deduction, Kansas didn't do anything. So the argument was, let's decouple them. That way you can take the standard on federal, itemize on the state. Because of that difference. Okay, what it would equate to in many instances is about a $500 and more tax that the state will end up with by no fault of its own, right? Thus the decoupling, the necessity of decoupling that. Well, what also happened with the same time was on a federal level, they reduced the corporate rate. Right? From like 35% to 21%. Brilliant, by the way. Absolutely brilliant. We are so far above in this country on what we tax corporations that's why they go to foreign countries. That's why they want to have operations elsewhere to pay tax.
Yeah.
Corporate tax in Ireland's 12%. We were at 35. You know how many people set up corporations in Ireland to run their money through? Just so they didn't pay more taxes. Right? You want a tax-friendly, business-friendly environment. So SB 22, when it did that, it also did some things with repatriation of foreign income. Okay, so it allowed foreign income to be repatriated at a very discounted rate so that money got out of those other countries where it was setting at a reduced tax rate, brought over here so you invest in America. Brilliant. What we've seen is 3% and 4% quarterly increases in economic growth in this country.
That's great.
Flippin' phenomenal. Kansas, unfortunately, hasn't participated to that level. Still working on some things, still thinking things will happen. But how SB 22 affected corporations on a local level is when it came in as repatriated income, Kansas has never taxed it. Okay, Kansas has never taxed repatriated foreign income. What we do tax is foreign dividends. Well, with the changes in the federal law, it caused some cascade effects to occur in state law that made the repatriation of corporate money back into Kansas now a taxable event. So what many states have done is they've said, hey, we didn't tax it before. We're not going to start taxing it now. So they've not only decoupled themselves individually, they've allowed that money to flow through tax-free, or again, at a very, very minimal rate.
Yeah.
Again, to stay business friendly, pro-business. So that's what SB 22 originally was. There was corporate benefit. There was individual benefit married together. Let's continue to give the taxpayer their money that they deserve. Let's allow corporations to continue to grow in Kansas, because that's what we need. And we have a lot of, I mean, look at the aircraft industry we have headquartered here, right? You talk about some international money.
Big deal.
Right? Cargill, right? You've got Agco. You've got some big business that has the opportunity to bring money back into this state, to invest right here, to build, create, grow jobs, create opportunities for our kids. Yet, as Kansans, we've got to pass this SB 22. Okay. Well, it passed the Senate. Great. Passed the Senate. Over in the House, it was amended in committee to also add on what is called the Main Street Fairness Act. Currently, we're required when we buy something online, if they don't collect sales tax, we're supposed to report that as use tax on our state tax return. Well, they added a piece in there that closed that loophole up, that simply said, okay, if you sell more than $100,000 worth of goods online, you're going to start collecting tax and remitting it to the state. The Wayfair decision on the U.S. Supreme Court made that all legal now, to where all online sales can be charged sales tax based on delivery. No big deal. Well, the thought there was the state would receive additional revenue from that. What can we do with that revenue? Let's do something productive with it. So we offset that with a reduction in food sales tax. So every 1% of food sales tax that is reduced is about $60 million in revenue. This was estimated to produce about $40 million in revenue, roughly, from closing that loophole up. So they said, well, we'll drop food sales tax 1% to offset that. So let's get it passed. The Senate decided to concur on that, put it on the governor's desk. Governor vetoed it. She said, nope, not going to happen. Some argue that it's because it was this corporate giveaway baloney. Well, if you just followed what I talked about, you can see there's no corporate giveaway. What SB 22 did was prevented a tax increase that the state of Kansas and the legislature never approved. That's what the windfall is. That's what decoupling is. That's what this whole process was about, is preventing a tax increase. Okay. So now governor vetoed it. There weren't enough votes to override it. You need 84 in the House, and I believe it was 27 or 28 in the Senate. Not enough votes to make it happen. So it stands. So now Kansans are going to pay those who itemize are going to pay about $500 more in tax. Corporations, you know what? I hope they don't. I hope they see the value in what we do here and in our workforce and in our kids. Missouri's decoupled. Many of the states around us are now much more tax-friendly to corporations. Okay? Look at aviation. You can do the numbers on aviation. Yeah. Our aviation employment has decreased by 17%, while Oklahoma's percentage of aviation employment has increased by 94%.
Amazing.
Because it is a corporate-friendly state. They've done the right things. Yeah. That's what we have to do here in Kansas. Okay? We've got to become corporate tax friendly, not only for the big corporations, but for the smaller ones, the mom and pop shops. We've got to create an environment that provides opportunity not only for their growth, but for jobs for our kids, because we continue to export our kids, raise great kids, give them a great education. They move to Texas. They move somewhere else, wherever, to go find the good jobs, because Kansas isn't a tax friendly state. That's what we have to do. People want to be in a tax-friendly state. You can look at Texas as a prime example of not only a corporate-friendly state, but a state that has no state income tax. You know Texas. That place is growing like crazy. It's craziness. We've got to change what we're doing here in this state to mimic some of those things, to create people and businesses wanting to locate here and utilize our tax force. And by not signing SB 22, we took a step backwards, and we raised taxes on individuals. We raised taxes on corporations. We didn't close the internet loophole and make a level playing field for our Main Street businesses that pay property taxes, that have homes here. Okay. So they're still competing against online retailers that don't collect sales tax. And we didn't lower food sales tax. How is that keeping any of the promises that were promised by our current governor? Promise no sales, no new taxes. Promise, to decrease food sales tax. The opportunities were right there. A lot of talk about what the future holds. Who knows? I'm not going to get into the governor. We don't see eye to eye on a number of things. It's perfectly fine. The people wanted her. The people got her. No problem. But SB 22 was a mistake that should have been signed into law, that would have been beneficial for this state, that would have been beneficial for the taxpayers and the corporations.
There's so much there, and we're running short on time for a lot of reasons. And I know we're going to do this again, but real quick, your accountability system that you're using when you go back to your site, when you go back to look at all the things that you've talked about promising, when you stood firm and got the door slammed in your face because you didn't want to pander to what somebody wanted you to say. You said what you believed you were going to do and what you were going to fight for, always keeping an open door to information and data. Saying, hey, I put my foot in my mouth. I ate crow, and getting on video and saying, guys, I did this one wrong. I didn't have this bit of information. Thank you guys. Named them out for helping me see some of this, and moving forward, and the appreciation that you got on those threads.
Oftentimes,
Well, and it's you get a little bit of everything, but when you step up and you do who you are and who I know you are, and those of us around you that get to see what you do and how you functioned for the last 20 years that I've known you, 20 plus years now, you are very consistent in who you are. And so when you hear politicians, even if I don't agree with them or I agree with them, that aren't fighting that same line,
right?
That's just frustrating, because that's what I think a lot of us, my age group, and you are tired of, and that's why we've turned it off. A lot of us don't realize the system, and I've learned so much by watching you and your journey on how our system works, and you've energized me on needing to be informed and wanting to be informed first, and then thinking not only is this a want, this is a need.
Right.
How does this process work? How does that bill get passed through? What does that look like in real world time? And then to see somebody doing it and dedicating and fighting, and your family in the trenches with you, doing everything they need to do. Your team from your company back behind you, and your soldiers out there, keeping things moving so you can focus on what you need to focus on to make our state better. It's just major sacrifices all the way around, and it all starts from your leadership.
Well.
And so I appreciate that.
No, and I appreciate that. A lot of what you touched on is very true. It's who I am. And again, it's all about doing this for the right reasons, and that is to make Kansas a better state. When I started this campaign, I was very clear to my family, to my friends, and to everybody that I'm not going to allow it to change who I am. I'm not going to allow this role to define me. Yeah. I want to be the same guy every single day that I was before this started, and that I will be when this is over, because this will be over at some point. Nobody is meant to be in this calling forever. These are not lifelong appointments, right? I am going to serve at the pleasure of my constituents. As long as I am doing my part and the majority of the voters feel that I am the one to be in that leadership position, I want to continue to serve. Okay? I look back on what I campaigned on, all of my promises. Well, actually, I didn't make promises per se, but I clearly campaigned on very specific issues. Right. This is how I see it. This is what I believe. This is how I will vote. And I can look back on that, and I can say with 100% certainty that I did exactly those things.
That's awesome.
And you can look at every newspaper article, and you can look at every post that I've made and see that I dug into those topics. I bore the burden. I researched it. I felt it. And I voted exactly how I told the constituency I was going to vote. And, that 55% that ultimately supported me in this campaign. And so, you know what, I feel very good about that. It may be against the status quo or what you're hearing on TV or what you're hearing over here or over there. But at the end of the day, those are the people that elected me based on what I told them I was going to do. Right. And I respect them because they respect me. And as we step forward in this journey, I will continue to do the exact same thing.
Well, and you're very good with utilizing media and your communication skills. You've refined that over the years, and you can do both written and verbal communications very strongly and very
Trying.
well, you're doing them.
Trying.
And that's not something I can't do the written communications for 1,000 reasons. I mean, I can do a little bit of verbal sometimes, but there's something really exciting. I don't know if you're ready to talk about that now. I've heard some little birds talking.
Oh man. Yeah. We're working, myself and one of my fellow representatives, Renee Erickson. She came in the same time I did. Wonderful representative out of Wichita. I have been kicking around this idea of starting our own kind of podcast and just really allowing people to be part of that conversation and to feel the journey as we go through it. Because again, her and I were very open, very transparent. We are who we are.
Yeah.
And we want people to be part of this journey as much as possible. So hopefully over the next couple months, this will start taking shape. No promises on when or what that deadline will look like.
Right.
But we really want to start this Rethink Kansas podcast and engage people and get feedback and allow us to use that and for them to not only understand where we are, but to touch a group of people that might not otherwise be engaged in politics.